Great. So
Okay,
now,
so
huh?
sorry, just introduce you, Mark Borthwick, the Salmon, Submerged Religion and Dreaming of Place. Thank you. May begin.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I've just finished a PhD here, here at the Open University. It'll be something a little different than what you've been hearing about at the conference so far, but hopefully you'll see why it's relevant. This picture in the opening slide is my home lake of Windermere. I grew up really close to here. I've swum there about 1,000 times probably. And there is millions of salmon in that lake. Or is there? I've never seen any. You've never seen them probably. They're down there maybe in a way that is, maybe analogous to religious thinking, which is something that we know, we think we know without evidence. So in that way, salmon are a promising loci of study, being out of view, rarely and passively observed, and, most often observed but embedded in human practice. So I'm looking at landscapes, waterscapes, and memory. And I'll start with a story. And it'll be a rattle through one of the most famous stories of all time. This is the salmon of wisdom. So the salmon lives in Ireland. It swims out under the sea to Tir na Nog, the land under waves, where it eats hazelnuts of wisdom from the well of wisdom, and then swims back to human society. There it meets a hero, Finn McCool. Now Finn is trying to catch the salmon of knowledge for his master. And he does. He catches it, he cooks it, burns his thumb on the fat, sucks the fat off the thumb, and in doing so, he absorbs the wisdom of the salmon that he got from the hazelnuts in the other world. And every time he wants to do anything wise, he puts his thumb in his mouth and he can access the wisdom of the other world. This allows him to become the leader of the Fianna, a fierce band of warriors in Irish myth. So my question to you is, who wrote this story? It was passed down through the oral culture. So maybe it was written by some ancient person, but it wasn't solely written by them. As being passed and forth between tellers for millennia without being codified in the written word, it is changed through the passing of many tongues. Anthony Nansen suggests that stories have evolved as a way for us to communicate ecological information for human survival. So they are stored between people in community as a kind of supragenetic knowledge. But the story isn't solely of human authorship. The salmon in the story isn't like an orc or a demon or a hobbit or a Pokemon that lives in the human mind without any external reference. The salmon exists in the world. It does in fact migrate beyond the waves. It does in fact return having changed. It returns with essential nutrients for the upper watershed. Salmon are a huge trophic flow from the ocean to the land. And knowledge of the salmon runs is a huge boon to prehistoric human survival. The salmon knowledge is precious and desirable. Because this story contains things that can only exist in the human mind because of the existence of the salmon out in the world, you could say that this story was at least partially authored by the fish. This is what is called by Beth Dempster and Donna Haraway, sympoiesis. Mythopoetic processes that emerge from complex entanglements across human species boundaries, and interplay emerging from intergenerational human-salmon relationships. A sympoetic approach means that human salmon and their structures, boats, fishing towns, salmon farms, cultures, and myth can all be understood as being continually co-created, shoring one each other up in their heterogeneous relations. The reason I bring up sympoiesis and salmon is that this can be informative for all of our mutual interest in the study of religion. Partial animal authorship could be something that is submerged in religious practice. Now, this phrase, barely submerged theology, comes from Edward Bering, who was writing in response to Derrida. He's talking about the materialism and ritualism of a freshly secularized society. He observed that seemingly non-religious institutions that were only very recently becoming detached from their religious roots may seem agnostic to issues of faith, but can have elements of praxis that are connected to their religious inheritances in ways that seem familiarly theological. Bering suggests everywhere we look in an ostensibly secular society, we see barely submerged religion. I like this notion because I think it fills in a theoretical gap between implicit religions and lived religions. Lived religions, developed by scholars like Orsi, focuses on how people actually practice and experience religion in their daily lives, often differing significantly from official doctrine or institutional prescriptions. Implicit religion, coined by Edward Bailey, refers to religious-like functions that secular activities, beliefs, or commitments serve in people's lives. This includes the ways non-religious phenomena can provide meaning, community transcendence, and ultimate concern, typically associated with religion. In the anthropology of religion, this limits us somewhat, looking at implicit factors among religious interlocutors. Any implicit factors amongst the openly religious is just religion, and any religion is proper and whole under a lived religion paradigm. So how might we access these theoretical undercurrents among interlocutors who might not be the most able to articulate and understand their faith? I recently had an evangelical interlocutor say Christians shouldn't study theology because it ruins your faith. But she clearly carries with her a whole host of theological knowledge, which perhaps she's not equipped or able to articulate. It's not implicit because it's openly religious, but it's not a lived religion in the same way other lived religions are, because it's unfelt, unknown, rather than lived out in the world, and it does come from some form of institutional authority. As discussed this morning, this is the grasping at the resonances of unfelt things. And perhaps some of this barely submerged theology is of fishy authorship, like the previously mentioned myth of Finn McCool. I would argue that there is a good example of this in pescatarianism. This is where people abstain from eating meat for any number of factors, but continue to eat fish, even though fish is very meat-like. If you look at this picture on the slide, maybe you can't tell which is fish and which is not. They are both of a fleshy quality. Indeed, in terms of the ethical quality to obtain the meat, it is the same deal that requires the killing of an animal. So why is it that everybody knows that fish is not meat, even though they're ostensibly very similar? I suggest the answer goes back 3,500 years to Mosaic eating laws. In Genesis 1, humans and animals are vegetarian. The breath of God is breathed in through the nostrils and goes into the blood, considered the site of nephesh or ensoulment. The Bible repeatedly and explicitly links ensoulment to blood, such as in Genesis 9:4. You must not eat meat that has its lifeblood, nephesh, still in it. And Leviticus 17, which says the life of a creature is in the blood. It's also notable that blood is the putative currency of sacrifice, representing the loci of animated existence, and fish face a number of obstacles being placed on the sacrificial altar, not least being kept long enough alive to get there. Additionally, cold-blooded creatures such as fish bleed very slowly. A sheep will die within an hour after having had its throat cut, but some fish can survive for an hour or more due to their cold-blooded physiology. There are a number of reasons that the connection between ensoulment, life, and blood would have been muted in ancient people when it came to fish. As a result of all this, fish carry with them a certain kind of spiritual purity. Fish are explicitly mentioned as clean in Leviticus. And Leviticus 17 forbids the eating of any animal which has not died a consecrated death, but fish are explicitly excluded. Out of all the animals labeled clean in Leviticus 11, only fish can be traded for expiation through blood sacrifice and do not need to be sanctified before being eaten. There is an attentiveness and a co-authorship here. Fish are cold-blooded and cannot be transported to the altar. These particular qualities that they are bringing with their physiology into the storytelling of this interaction, then combined with the human values and praxis, creating a category that sets them apart from other animals, despite their many ostensible similarities. It is this purity that allowed fish to be exempted from eating laws in the medieval times. Now, abstention from meat was commonplace and highly prescribed. Meat was viewed as injurious to spiritual contemplation and banned by the church for consumption on fast days. And there was an extensive calendar of fast days. Between Lent, Advent, 3 routine fast days a week, and the day before any Christian feast day, more than half of all calendar days were counted as fast days, meaning eating fish was prohibited. I didn't know this. Maybe you knew this already, being scholars of religion, but I didn't know this. Carnival, the Christian festival before Lent, is so named because it's when the meat would be eaten. Carnival literally means farewell to meat in Latin. But fish was not included. By the 16th century, fast days were enforced by the state and were announced in an ad hoc fashion to manage supply and demand of meat, with non-observance punishable by substantial fines and prison time. These proclamations were also applied to the British colonies overseas. Fast days became known as fish days because of the eating of fish on those days colloquially, and then later in royal decrees. And this lasted for over a millennia. From the 8th to the 18th century was the enforced prescription of fish days. As a result, monks ate lots of fish. They situated their monasteries on productive rivers. We're lucky enough that Winchester Priory recorded its meals for 278 days in 1514, and fish was the main course for 60% of those days. Westminster Abbey, which is recorded as consuming tens of tons of fish per annum, fishermen were allowed to give their tithes in salmon, and if they did, they would eat at the highest table above the monks. Records from Winchester Monastery show that salmon, either salted or fresh, was eaten twice a year round. During Lent, they fried the salmon in dough to simulate pork. Food scholar Massimo Montanari says that the diffusion of Christianity plays a significant and perhaps decisive role in creating a tradition of fish consumption in Europe and also through the colonial system abroad. As a result, through the enforcement of these rules, Christianity played a huge role in global fish culture in North America. Fish continue to feature there as a note of resistance to colonial encounter. More of that later. The enduring legacy of these historical practices remain evident in contemporary religious observances and institutional practices. Fish is still culturally eaten by many groups during Lent, and maybe many public institutions, including my own high school in the early 2000s, continue to serve fish on Fridays. The most recent apostolic constitution, a papal declaration of Catholic law, the most recent one to engage with fasting was 1966, in which Paul VI declined the opportunity to close the loophole and does not stretch the definition of meat to include fish. In 2011, English bishops had it reaffirmed to their congregants that Catholics should abstain from meat on a Friday, preferring fish. This is why I would categorize it as submerged. It's not implicit. It is, in fact, explicitly religious, and it's coming from a religious doctrine and a source of authority which challenges the implicit religions and the lived religions paradigm. It is followed in an unfelt and unknown way. In my research, I've yet to encounter a Christian who can tell me why these fish are set apart from animals in their eating traditions, and the thought leaders I've spoken to, academics, cited in the notes to this presentation, do not align with their reasons as to why. I'll move on. This plays out in all aspects of fishy life, including fish slaughter. I decided to not give you a picture of fish slaughter. I gave you something much more grisly, which is my face. This is in the House of Lords, where I'm talking about the law surrounding fish slaughter. You wouldn't know it looking at the furniture, but the red carpet gives it away. And also just look at how entertained those two people are. They're having a great time. That's how entertained you look in your little Microsoft Teams windows. Really thoroughly fascinated. Anyway, the law surrounding fish welfare, fish slaughter, maps more closely onto the religious distinctions than it does to any biological category. In the UK, fish is still exempt from almost all slaughter legislation, are the only species that are farmed to not have species-specific slaughter prescriptions. You can still kill whales and fish that will be totally illegal for any other animal, and this is even though salmon is the second most farmed species in the country after chickens. Lord Sandy Trees, head of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Animal Welfare, said that this is a legislative lacuna, which we should, in order to be consistent, close. I would indicate this legislative lacuna has a submerged religious quality. Fish are set apart, as they were in the sacrificial altar in contemporary Western law. This continues overseas. The 1966 US Animal Welfare Act defines animals as dogs, cats, monkeys, any non-human primate animals, guinea pigs, hamsters, and rabbits, and was amended in the 1970s to include warm-blooded animals. In 2019, a North Carolina resident abandoned his pet fish in a tank, leaving it to die. He was caught, and he was taken to court, and he had the animal cruelty charges thrown out by the district attorney, Ben David, who pointed out that fish were not included in the legal definition of animals. Indeed, looking at that definition, it includes every living vertebrate in the classes Amphibia, Reptilia, Aves, birds, and Mammalia, except human beings. Note that this includes every vertebrate class except for aquatic ones. These taxonomies come from Leviticus. They are implicitly religious. I don't think that Ben David or the fish farmers knew that they were upholding an ancient Jewish law. This next slide is a little grisly. So it shows a salmon in distress, so full warning. There are so many pictures that I've taken that are too miserable to print, so this one is fairly tame, but still. Here we see a salmon covered in lice. You can see that it's stripped the skin off the back of its head. It's there on the nose. You can see some lice have lashed onto its eye. If you follow the news, you know that fish suffer in salmon farms in this country, the UK, in an unprecedented scale. Salmon are the second most farmed animal, as I've said, and they are totally unprotected. Millions of salmon die in factory farms in British waters with mortality rates of 40% plus. Much has been made in animal studies of the power of attentiveness. You could say this is a failure of attentiveness. There is an imbalance in the sympathetic process. We are attentive to the salmon's cold-bloodedness, sure. We have failed to attend to the salmon's capacity to study and to suffer and to live a good life. I enjoyed what was said earlier today by Professor Lily Kong about the role of religious studies is to sharpen theory and shape policy. Well, there are religious elements to the theory and religious inheritances to this policy. I know this is a grisly slide, so I'll move on. My final reflection to offer is a reflection on the theme of this panel, which is place. We've touched on medieval monasteries sited on salmon rivers. Many cities were sited on salmon rivers as well as a result, including London, Glasgow, Toronto, Canterbury, and too many others to name. Toronto takes its name from the salmon weirs, which were the oldest structures in North America that were on that site. Salmon swim upstream once a year to spawn and then promptly die, depositing an incredible amount of ocean biomass up into the watershed. You can see in that picture how many salmon are migrating in that river. This makes them a staple food and a huge boon, ecologically intensifying the upper watershed in a way which is very useful for animal and human survival. In many places today, dams are being knocked down or bypassed to allow the salmon to return to their home rivers to spawn. And salmon are important collaborators in the forming of place. In the USA, the Alaskan Native Claim Settlement Act system was created in the 1960s in response to an extraction of the salmon resources by non-natives. It pays dividends to indigenous people for the salmon resources used, creating what has been described as the nearest analog to a sovereign wealth fund under US federal law. This is also seen elsewhere in numerous places in Canada. In this way, the salmon, through paying this dividend, allow the people to remain there. Across North America, we see a pattern of indigenous people petitioning lawmakers to make sure fish stocks are not so depleted that they cannot continue to make a living through subsistence fishing. In this way, the salmon and the indigenous people are intercontingent on access to one another. The Métis people, for example, are dependent on the fish to prevent themselves from being forced to move on, and the fish depend on human advocacy to prevent themselves being fished to extinction. Neither group has the capital to survive the changes brought to the environment by their settlers without the help of one another. This is another kind of symbiosis, not only the human-salmon correlation to settle in these places, but proper attentive relationships allow both humans and salmon to survive there. That's me on time. Hopefully 15 minutes isn't very long, but hopefully it's enough to instigate or provoke or whet your appetite. So if anything that I've said has been interesting to you, please feel free to ask a question or to reach out to me or my details in the slide right there.